In the shimmering heat of a Las Vegas summer night, under the iconic dome of Caesar's Palace Grand Arena, tension pulsed through the air like static before a lightning strike. This wasn't just another exhibition. It was a moment pregnant with anticipation, ripe with ego, and unknowingly balanced on the edge of transformation. The crowd of nearly 3,000 leaned forward in their seats, breaths held, eyes fixed on the polished canvas stage. This was the International Martial Arts Showcase, but what unfolded that evening would be remembered as something far more significant. Among the luminaries and legends, a young, rising fighter named Joe Louis strode into the spotlight with swagger. The arena thundered with his arrival, a mix of cheers and jeers chasing his gold-trimmed robe as it rippled behind him. At only 28, Louis was a physical specimen, a towering presence at 6'2", muscles carved from relentless training and the streets of Philadelphia alike. He was undefeated, charismatic, powerful, and, most noticeably, cocky. He didn't just believe he could take on the world, he relished proving it, especially against anyone who stood as a symbol of the old guard. High in the shadows, seated quietly in the front row, was Chuck Norris. At 43, Norris exuded the kind of authority that doesn't need to be announced. There was no entourage, no spotlight, no noise around him, just a calm presence that radiated strength. A former world karate champion, Air Force veteran, and martial arts icon, Chuck had already done it all, and yet, in that moment, he simply observed. Master Tanaka, an aged and revered karate master who had trained champions for over 50 years, noticed Chuck's arrival. Their eyes met briefly, a silent bow exchanged. Joe Louis, meanwhile, was soaking in the arena's energy like fuel. With a grin that was part movie star, part predator, he taunted the audience, the masters, the tradition itself. He grabbed the mic and declared that he wasn't there to revolutionize martial arts. He was there to expose the frauds. His words hit like jabs. Half these masters learned their moves from books. I learned mine by breaking jaws. It wasn't long before his gaze landed briefly, but unmistakably, on Chuck Norris. A glance so sharp it sliced through the noise, signaling a challenge not yet spoken aloud. Then came the first match. Joe was paired with Master Hyun Jung Gil, a 52-year-old Korean grandmaster with a reputation forged over decades across 3 continents. Where Joe moved like a hungry panther, Master Hyun moved with serene precision, his stance a sculpture of balance and experience. The bell rang, and 2 worlds collided. Joe struck fast and hard, his combinations crisp and violent. Hyun countered with traditional form, each move graceful, deliberate, but increasingly overwhelmed. When Joe landed a spinning back kick that crumpled the master, the arena gasped. The match was over, and Joe had made his point, or so he thought. Back in his seat, Chuck Norris remained still, his eyes locked on the young fighter parading in the ring. Tanaka leaned in and whispered, "The young one has talent." Chuck nodded. "Tremendous talent," he replied. "Shame about everything else." But Joe wasn't finished. The win had only whet his appetite for glory. As the announcer prepared for the next bout, Joe seized the mic again, uninvited. His voice rang out like a bell across the arena. "I see some celebrities here tonight. One in particular who made a whole career playing tough guys on screen." The audience turned their heads, following Joe's gaze straight to Chuck Norris. The challenge was no longer subtle. It was public, personal, and electric. "Come on, Chuck," Joe sneered. "No stunt doubles this time. Just you and me. Let's give these people something real." The crowd stirred. Gasps turned into chants. First a ripple, "Joe, Joe, Joe, Joe." Then a counterwave, "Chuck, Chuck, Chuck." The atmosphere transformed into something primal. Cameras swiveled. Journalists leaned forward. The promoter panicked. Chuck remained still, but those who knew him saw it. The shift in posture, the narrowing of the eyes, the kindling of something dangerous beneath his calm. Joe pressed harder, circling like a carnival barker. "What's the matter, Chuck?" Worried about fighting without a script? Then, with quiet composure, Chuck Norris stood. The act alone triggered a tidal wave of noise. It wasn't just the rise of a man, it was the rise of a legend. He handed his jacket to Master Tanaka, who accepted it with silent gravity. Words weren't needed. Something ancient had been set in motion. The promoter rushed forward, desperate to stop the impromptu duel. "This isn't sanctioned," he warned. "The insurance won't cover it." Chuck raised a hand gently. "It's just an exhibition," he said softly, that Texas drawl wrapping around the word like velvet over steel. He walked toward the ring with the precision of a warrior who didn't need to prove anything but would still fight with everything if called. The audience hushed, thousands of heartbeats sinking into one suspended rhythm. Chuck entered the ring. And the past met the present. Joe, tall, muscular, brimming with youthful arrogance. Chuck, compact, efficient, radiating calm power honed through decades of mastery. The referee, rattled but professional, gave them the rules. Full contact, but stoppable at his discretion. Joe offered his glove with a smirk. "No hard feelings after I humiliate you, right?" Chuck tapped it once, then walked away without a word. Master Tanaka leaned forward again. "Joe fights with fire," he said, "but Chuck fights with silence." The bell rang. Joe exploded with speed. Jab, cross, hook, flawless execution, a blur of fists aimed to intimidate, dominate, dismantle. Chuck didn't block. He didn't retreat. He simply wasn't there when the strikes arrived. Subtle movements, an inch here, a shift of weight there. The punches passed through air. Joe intensified. Kicks, knees, angles. But Chuck remained untouchable, floating just outside the storm like a shadow on water. From the sidelines, martial artists began to murmur. This wasn't defense. It was poetry. "Fight back!" Joe barked, frustrated. His roundhouse roared through the air, only to be caught on Chuck's forearm, a statue absorbing a wave. Still, Chuck didn't strike. He was waiting, watching, studying. Then, in one perfectly timed beat, he moved. A single, straight punch to the solar plexus. Clean, controlled, devastating in its elegance. Joe staggered back, not from pain, but from realization. He had just been taught something. The blow Chuck Norris delivered was not meant to humiliate, but to reveal. The crowd's roar softened into a hush. Every pair of eyes locked on the ring, trying to understand what had just transpired. Joe Louis, for the first time in his meteoric career, found himself off balance, not physically, but mentally. The narrative he'd built, the bravado, the certainty that strength meant domination, began to crack. Joe regrouped quickly, but something fundamental had changed. The self-assurance in his eyes was now mixed with doubt, the trademark smirk tempered by an unsettling awareness that the game he thought he was playing was, in fact, a deeper game altogether. He launched at Chuck again, faster, harder, hoping that brute force might overcome the invisible barrier he'd just encountered. His fists snapped out. His feet tore through the air, combinations he'd perfected over years of grinding work on the streets and in the gym. But Chuck's response was the same minimal movement, effortless slips, the calm of a man who understood that true power lay in restraint. The crowd, which had moments earlier bayed for blood, began to sense the rarity of what they were witnessing. Some shifted in their seats, impatient for action. But the true martial artists leaned in, recognizing a masterclass unfolding. It was not just a battle of bodies, but of philosophies. Master Tanaka watched, his weathered hands gripping his knees. "He's not just defending," Tanaka whispered to the young student beside him. "He's controlling the fight through defense, making Louis work twice as hard for half the result." Joe, now feeling the strain, pressed forward. He unleashed a flurry jab, cross, hook, leg kick, a signature sequence that had dropped opponents in his rise to fame. Chuck's defense was art in motion. A slip here, a parry there, a block at the precise moment, a check that neutralized the leg kick, all with such subtlety that to the untrained eye it might seem like nothing at all. But every movement meant everything. The air in the arena grew thick, every breath hanging on what would come next. Journalists in the press row furiously typed, already composing their headlines. "Humbled champion learns mid-fight. Norris teaches masterclass in ring efficiency." Frustration flickered in Joe's eyes. He had thrown his best at this man, and all he had achieved was to be countered, not with brutality, but with perfect timing and quiet authority. The sweat on his brow, the fatigue in his stance, it was new, unsettling, and humbling. Chuck, meanwhile, remained centered. His breathing slow, his posture unchanged. It was as if the years melted away, the movies and the fame stripped back to the essence of the martial artist he had always been. This was the discipline that could not be faked. This was the mastery forged through endless repetition, hardship, and the humility to always be learning. Joe tried a new angle. He feinted with a jab, then launched a powerful roundhouse toward Chuck's midsection. The technique was crisp, executed with the precision that had brought him glory. But Chuck shifted just enough to let the kick sail by harmlessly. Then, almost as if in slow motion, he countered with a punch to Joe's ribs. Not to hurt, but to teach. The crowd gasped. It was a moment of clarity. Joe, for the first time, realized he was not just fighting another man. He was confronting a living philosophy, a lesson written in sweat, silence, and self-control. In that instant, the audience's mood changed. No longer did they clamor for a knockout. Instead, a deep respect settled over the arena, a recognition that something extraordinary was taking place before their eyes. The energy was no longer about victory or defeat, it was about revelation. The two men circled, their exchange now less about showmanship, more about understanding. Joe's next attacks, once filled with swagger, were now executed with a seriousness and focus that hadn't been there before. He was learning, even as he fought. Every block, every parry, every counter from Chuck became a lesson, a nudge toward humility. "Why doesn't Norris attack more?" a young martial artist asked his mentor in the front row. He is attacking, the old instructor replied softly. He's attacking Joe's ego, showing him the true meaning of mastery. With each minute, the contest became less about the clash of fists and more about the transformation of a soul. Joe Louis, once a brash challenger, was being remade in the crucible of honest combat. His own natural athleticism, still astonishing, began to blend with the lessons he was absorbing in real time. But it was not just Joe who was changing. Chuck Norris, too, recognized the journey underway. He had faced countless opponents, but few were willing to learn in the heat of the moment, to adapt and grow even as they struggled. Respect flickered in Chuck's eyes, a recognition of potential, of a spirit being forged. The final seconds of the round ticked away. Joe summoned every ounce of his skill for one last spectacular attack, a spinning hook kick, the kind of move that had stunned audiences and opponents alike. But Chuck, calm and present, slipped a kick by the narrowest margin, then delivered a final, gentle punch to Joe's solar plexus. Their eyes met, a current of understanding flowing between them. The bell rang. The crowd erupted, but the applause was different now, no longer frenzied, but appreciative. Many were on their feet, overcome not by spectacle, but by the sense that they had witnessed something rare and precious, the transformation of a fighter in real time. For a moment, the two men stood in the center of the ring, both breathing harder, but both present and fully alive in the moment. Joe bowed, deeply and properly, acknowledging not just Chuck's skill, but the philosophy that had just changed him. Chuck returned the bow with equal formality, a silent agreement between warriors. And as the referee raised Chuck's hand in victory, a mere formality, the real triumph belonged to both. For Joe, it was the first step on a new path. For Chuck, it was the satisfaction of having shown the deeper purpose of martial arts, that true strength is measured not in domination, but in the willingness to learn, to grow, and to show respect. In that instant, Las Vegas had witnessed more than a fight. It had seen the birth of humility, the power of restraint, and the undeniable truth that mastery always outlasts bravado. As the cheers in the grand arena faded into murmurs and the crowd slowly dispersed, a profound hush settled over those who remained. The fight, which began as a spectacle of ego and ended as a testament to humility, had already taken root in the memories of everyone who witnessed it. In the world of martial arts, there were victories measured in applause, and there were victories measured in understanding, and tonight it was the latter that would echo farthest. Back in the dressing rooms, the energy was different. Joe Louis sat alone, a towel draped around his neck, his breathing slowing. The cocky grin that had been his trademark, his shield against doubt, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his reflection in the mirror revealed a young man at a crossroads, vulnerable, thoughtful, and searching for meaning in what had just transpired. The door creaked open. Joe's manager entered, voice already running ahead, eager to craft a story that would shield his fighter's image. "We'll tell them it was just an exhibition, Joe. Nothing serious." "You were holding back." But for the first time, Joe interrupted, his tone quiet but resolute. "No, we're not going to say any of that." He met his manager's eyes in the mirror, a calm determination in his gaze. "My image. What people think. That's what got me in trouble tonight. I was so busy being Joe Louis the showman, I forgot to be Joe Louis the fighter." The words lingered in the air, heavy with realization. It wasn't about protecting an illusion anymore. Tonight had stripped away the trappings of ego and exposed something truer beneath. "Tell them I met a better martial artist," Joe said softly, "and that I learned something. Tell them I'll be better next time." Meanwhile, as Chuck Norris exited the ring, the quiet that followed him was as powerful as any ovation. Master Tanaka met him near the edge of the platform, handing him his jacket with a nod of quiet approval. "You taught more than fighting tonight," the old master remarked, his eyes twinkling with a secret satisfaction. Chuck slipped on his jacket, pausing only to glance back at the ring, a place where more than muscle and skill had been tested. "The best lessons aren't spoken," he replied. "They're lived." Together, they walked out into the Vegas night, leaving behind a crowd forever changed by the events they'd witnessed. But in the hearts of both men, and especially Joe, the night was not truly over. Its meaning would ripple out for years, reframing what it meant to be a fighter, a master, and, most importantly, a student of life. As dawn crept over Las Vegas, the city buzzed with stories. Headlines blared, "Silent Thunder, Norris teaches masterclass in restraint." On television, sports analysts dissected every movement, every look, every word exchanged in the ring. But what truly captivated those who had seen it in person was the invisible transformation. How an arena obsessed with glory and spectacle had, for one rare night, become a temple of humility and respect. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Chuck Norris was already in the hotel gym, dressed simply, moving through his forms with the same devotion he'd shown for decades. There was no triumph in his expression, only focus. Yesterday's victory was history. Today's training was all that mattered. At precisely 6 o'clock, the gym door opened again. Joe Louis appeared, no longer the brash young contender, but a man changed by the fires of experience. He wore simple clothes, his eyes filled with a mix of humility and newfound purpose. For a moment he hesitated, unsure of his place. But Chuck looked up, nodded a greeting, and gestured for Joe to join him. There, in the quiet morning, teacher and student met not for spectacle, but for something more valuable, learning. Joe began hesitantly. About last night? But Chuck simply waited, letting the silence do its work. The lessons that matter most often emerge in the spaces between words. Joe tried again, searching for the right language. That counter you used? I've never seen anything like it. Chuck nodded. It's not about the technique, it's about the timing. And timing comes from patience. For the next hour, they worked together, not as adversaries, but as fellow travelers on the same eternal path. Chuck corrected Joe's movements, showing him how intention telegraphs itself before a punch or kick is ever thrown, how real power comes not from force, but from presence. The training was intense, honest, and transformative. Joe's athleticism was obvious, but now, as he absorbed each lesson, his mindset began to shift. He listened, he adjusted, he dropped the need to impress. And for the first time, Chuck saw the makings of a true martial artist, a man who fought not to dominate others, but to master himself. As the morning light filled the gym, the awkwardness dissolved, replaced by a mutual respect earned in sweat and humility. Joe asked questions. Chuck answered plainly, never condescending. A genuine bond began to form, forged in the crucible of honest effort. When their session ended, both were soaked with sweat. But something else had changed. A sense of possibility had been born. Joe, once desperate to prove himself to the world, now found a new drive to prove himself to himself. Same time tomorrow? Joe asked as they gathered their gear. Chuck studied him, searching for sincerity, then nodded. Tomorrow. As Joe left to face the press and public, he carried with him not the sting of defeat, but the spark of growth. He had glimpsed a different kind of strength, the kind that doesn't fade with time or rely on applause. And Chuck, for his part, saw in Joe the hope that every master holds for the next generation, that their knowledge, hard-won and often misunderstood, will not be lost, but passed on, refined, and made new again. In the days that followed, the legend of the fight grew. Promoters came knocking with offers of rematches, headlines boomed about the grudge match of the decade. But for Chuck, it was never about money or spectacle or fame. Integrity, he told a would-be promoter, that's what matters. And with that, he walked away from the offer, content in the knowledge that the true victory had already been won in the quiet dawn of self-realization. For Joe Louis, the impact was equally lasting. When he returned to the ring months later, the swagger was gone, the flashy entrances replaced by focused preparation, the taunts by quiet confidence. He fought not just to win, but to embody the lessons learned that unforgettable night in Las Vegas. When asked what changed, his answer was simple. True power doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs purpose. And so the exhibition at Caesar's Palace became the stuff of legend, not for knockouts or bravado, but for the rare glimpse it gave into the soul of martial arts itself. That strength is found not in domination, but in restraint, that real mastery is silent, patient, and humble, and that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from defeating another, but from finding a better version of yourself. In the days and weeks after the exhibition, the legend of the fight took on a life of its own. Martial arts schools across America buzzed with conversation, and young students reenacted what they'd seen, trying to mimic Joe's explosive kicks or Chuck's barely there defensive slips. Yet what truly lingered was not the spectacle of movement, but the transformation that happened in front of thousands, the visible, dramatic evolution of a fighter's spirit. In dojos and gyms from Los Angeles to Tokyo, instructors pointed to the story as a modern parable. They asked their students, what is the real lesson here? Some said it was about humility, others about perseverance, and still others about the courage to change. Master Tanaka, in his own quiet way, summed it up best for his class. To conquer another is strength. To conquer oneself is true power. The press, hungry for controversy, at first tried to stoke rivalry between Chuck Norris and Joe Louis. Articles speculated about bad blood, about whether a rematch would be arranged, about who really deserved the last word. But as the days passed, a different narrative began to emerge. Writers for Black Belt Magazine and Sports Illustrated published features that dug deeper than headlines. They described the way Chuck Norris had used the ring not as a stage for self-glorification, but as a classroom. They praised Joe for his willingness to learn in the face of public challenge. One photograph became iconic, Joe Louis bowing deeply in the aftermath of defeat, and Chuck Norris returning the gesture, not as conqueror and vanquished, but as teacher and student, equals in respect. The image appeared everywhere, often captioned with words like "the moment of truth" or "respect above victory." In a culture obsessed with winning, this simple act of humility became revolutionary. Meanwhile, the city of Las Vegas itself had been changed by the fight. Local martial arts academies saw an influx of students, many drawn by the idea that real power wasn't just about physical prowess, but about mastering one's ego. Even gamblers and showgirls found themselves discussing the philosophical undercurrents of the event at late-night diners and breakfast buffets. The phrase "Chuck Norris" entered the local slang, meaning to win quietly, without fanfare. Joe Louis, for his part, felt the changes most acutely. He returned home to Philadelphia, welcomed by his old gym, but no longer the same man. His former bravado had been replaced with a grounded sense of purpose. He spent long hours in training, focusing less on building a persona and more on refining technique, timing, and most of all, awareness. He studied tapes not just of his own fights, but of Chuck's, seeking to understand the philosophy behind every subtle movement. He kept his promise to himself and to Chuck. Whenever he stepped into the ring, he did so with the quiet confidence of a man searching for mastery, not applause. He won fights, and he lost a few, but with each match, his reputation grew, not just as a formidable competitor, but as a martial artist whose greatest weapon was now his humility. When reporters asked him about the night at Caesar's Palace, his answer became legend. "I went in to expose a fraud, but I found a teacher instead." True strength isn't about who you can beat, it's about who you can become. As for Chuck Norris, he resumed his life with little fanfare. He returned to Hollywood, appearing in films and television, but always making time for the discipline that had shaped him: early morning training, mentoring younger fighters, and quietly supporting martial arts schools and community projects. He never spoke at length about the fight unless pressed, but when asked, his response was always the same: "The greatest victories are those we win over ourselves." The impact of the exhibition resonated for years, inspiring not just martial artists, but athletes, coaches, and everyday people. Parents told their children the story, not as a tale of winning and losing, but as a lesson in growth and integrity. Business leaders referenced it in speeches about resilience and humility. The moment when Joe Louis bowed and asked Chuck to teach him became a symbol for anyone seeking to transform arrogance into wisdom. 6 months later, Joe Louis entered the World Championship with a new approach. Gone were the flashing lights and aggressive taunts. He moved with a focused calm, a quiet intensity that radiated through the crowd. He won the fight by unanimous decision. When asked what made the difference, he didn't talk about training regimens or special techniques. Instead, he said simply, "I learned that true power doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs purpose." Somewhere in Texas, Chuck watched the interview and allowed himself a rare, satisfied smile. The lesson had taken root, not through force or humiliation, but through respect and a willingness to learn. And so, the story of that Las Vegas night became more than legend. It became a blueprint for a new kind of victory, a reminder that the real arena is always inside us, and that the bravest thing any fighter or any person can do is to keep striving for mastery, not just of their craft, but of their own character. As the months rolled on, the events of that fateful Las Vegas night became a source of conversation, not just within martial arts communities, but in circles far removed from the ring. The story spread like wildfire through barbershops, college campuses, and late-night talk shows. People from every walk of life saw in it a parable of ego, humility, and transformation. Chuck Norris and Joe Louis were no longer just fighters. They became symbols, their actions, a canvas on which others painted their own struggles and aspirations. In martial arts dojos from Japan to Brazil, the legend of the night arrogance bowed to mastery was dissected in classes. Masters used the story to illustrate the idea that the most difficult opponent anyone faces is themselves. "Control your mind, and the body will follow," teachers said, quoting both Tanaka and Norris. They encouraged students to strive for mastery, but to do so quietly, with humility, understanding that there is always someone stronger, someone wiser. Students who once mimicked Joe Louis's flashy entrances now paid attention to Chuck Norris's economy of motion, the way he moved with intention, how he answered aggression with calm. They began to see that true respect wasn't earned by domination, but by a willingness to learn, even in the heat of competition. And for the first time, many of these young athletes began to see their rivals not as enemies to be defeated, but as partners in growth. Parents, too, found themselves telling the story to their children. Around dinner tables, they spoke of a brash young man who thought he had all the answers, and the elder who showed him the truth, not with anger or violence, but with patience and skill. In classrooms, teachers wove the tale into lessons about character, resilience, and the long game of self-improvement. And in unexpected places, the story became a beacon for those facing their own struggles. Veterans dealing with loss, business people grappling with setbacks, artists wrestling with self-doubt all saw in Joe's journey a reflection of their own challenges. The message was universal. Humility is not weakness, and real growth begins the moment you admit you still have something to learn. For Chuck Norris, life after the fight remained steady and disciplined. Despite the renewed attention, he kept to his routine, training, teaching, working on film projects, and quietly donating to causes that supported young athletes. He was invited to give speeches about winning the inner battle, and though he rarely sought the spotlight, his words carried the weight of lived experience. Everyone fights to win, Chuck would say, but not everyone understands what winning truly means. The real victory is in growth, becoming better than you were yesterday. He started giving seminars, not on how to defeat opponents in the ring, but on the importance of self-mastery and honest reflection. He shared the story of his loss and how it became his greatest victory, with authenticity and vulnerability. Fighters and fans alike came to listen, drawn by the power of his journey from arrogance to understanding. Whenever Joe entered a room, he no longer led with bravado. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions and was quick to give credit to others. His greatest endorsement was now the respect of those who had watched him change, not only on the night of the fight, but in the days and months that followed. Their example sparked a wave of similar stories across the combat sports world. Fighters who once prioritized showmanship now sought out genuine teachers. Younger competitors, once eager for the spotlight, learned the value of discipline, patience, and mutual respect. Even the media's tone shifted, with more stories focusing on the quiet heroes of sport, those who won not just on the scorecards, but in the ongoing battle to be better than they were the day before. It became clear that the true legacy of that night was not a single victory or defeat, but a revolution of spirit. Chuck and Joe's encounter showed that it's possible to compete fiercely and still honor your opponent, to pursue greatness while remaining open to growth, and to turn even the most public setbacks into powerful lessons. In the years that followed, the story became woven into the culture of martial arts and beyond. A living reminder that the greatest champions are not those who dominate, but those who inspire others to rise above their limitations. And as each new generation stepped into the ring, they carried with them the wisdom forged in the quiet moments after the fight, that the real opponent always is the self. Years passed, but the night when Chuck Norris and Joe Louis faced each other in Caesar's Palace never faded from memory. Its story moved through generations like a myth, whispered from teacher to student, from parent to child. And yet, the heart of that story remained alive for the two men who had lived it most directly. For Joe Louis, the transformation sparked by his public humbling was neither instant nor easy. Old habits sometimes crept back, flashes of ego, the urge to prove himself, the echo of cheers that once fueled his confidence. But now, there was a deeper wisdom beneath the surface. Whenever Dow returned, he would remember Chuck's quiet control, the effortless defense, the patient counter that did more than win a match. It opened a door to a new way of being. He poured himself into training, sometimes alone, sometimes with young fighters who came to him seeking not just technique, but truth. His advice shifted over the years. He spoke less about how to win and more about why we fight, what we're searching for in ourselves when we step onto the mat, into the ring, or out into the world each morning. He shared stories of failure as readily as stories of triumph, teaching his students that losing, if met with open eyes and an open heart, is simply a beginning. Joe never forgot that morning after the fight, when he met Chuck in the gym as a student for the first time. The memory of repeating that spinning kick, of hearing Chuck's calm guidance about patience and timing, became a kind of talisman, a standard to hold himself against. Every new lesson he learned, he passed on, hoping that someone, somewhere, would avoid the mistakes he had made and find their own way toward growth. Chuck Norris, meanwhile, continued to embody the silent virtues he had demonstrated in the ring. The world changed around him. Fads rose and fell, new champions came and went, but his core remained steady. Whether he was appearing in a film, teaching a seminar, or walking quietly through a neighborhood park, those who met him found the same presence they'd seen in Las Vegas, grounded, patient, gentle, yet unshakably strong. He became, for thousands, a symbol of a different kind of heroism. The kind that faces challenges without bravado, that understands restraint is sometimes a greater show of power than domination. The phrase Norris calm became a shorthand for poise under pressure, the ability to stay centered when storms rage all around. The martial arts community, too, shifted in the wake of their story. Tournaments became less about spectacle and more about the cultivation of character. Fighters began to see their journey as one of lifelong self-improvement, a never-ending pursuit of wisdom and grace both on and off the mat. The lesson that mastery was not about defeating others, but about refining oneself, became central to the ethos of schools around the world. In media and pop culture, their story was revisited countless times. Books were written, documentaries produced, and podcasts recorded, each retelling adding new layers of meaning. Yet, at its core, the narrative remained the same, that humility, respect, and the courage to change are worth more than any trophy or fleeting fame. Joe Louis, in his later years, often reflected on the unexpected gift he'd received from that single night in Las Vegas. "It wasn't the punch that changed me," he once said in a quiet interview. "It was the lesson behind it. I thought I was going to expose someone else's weakness, but what I found was my own, and that's when I finally started to become strong." For Chuck, the impact was measured not in awards or headlines, but in the lives he touched. He saw former rivals become friends, young students become teachers, and a generation of fighters learn to value stillness and self-awareness as much as speed or strength. Whenever someone thanked him for what he had shown the world, he would simply nod and say, "I only showed what was already inside you." And so, the story of that legendary night became less about who won or lost and more about the possibility of transformation. It became a blueprint for turning adversity into insight and for recognizing that the only victory that matters is the one over our lesser selves. As both men aged, their paths crossed occasionally at events, charity fundraisers, or private gatherings of martial arts masters. Each time, there was a quiet understanding between them, a glance, a smile, sometimes a brief exchange about family or students or the ever-changing world outside the gym. Neither needed to revisit the fight in words. Both knew its meaning lived on in the choices they made, the people they inspired, and the legacy they left behind. The ripple effect of their encounter reached places neither could have imagined. Prisons where inmates practiced martial arts for rehabilitation, hospitals where children learned patience through movement, schools where bullied kids found confidence and bullies discovered humility. In all these places, the spirit of that night in Las Vegas lived on, quietly changing lives, one heart at a time. As time went on, the legendary confrontation between Chuck Norris and Joe Louis at Caesar's Palace passed from living memory into the realm of modern myth. Yet, unlike so many stories that are lost to exaggeration or hollow retelling, this one grew deeper, more meaningful, each time it was shared. Its power came not from spectacle or violence, but from the raw honesty at its heart. Decades later, new generations of martial artists still gathered in gyms and dojos to watch old recordings, their instructors pausing at key moments to ask, "What do you see here?" Some pointed out Joe Louis's explosive skill. Others marveled at Chuck Norris's calm, but those who looked more closely saw the invisible exchange. The humility it took to bow after defeat, the grace to teach without gloating, the quiet handshake that spoke volumes about respect earned and given. It was not lost on anyone that the most important moments of that night happened after the final bell, the bow, the handshake, and the morning after, when student returned to teacher seeking wisdom. These gestures became the true signature moves of both men, far more important than any spinning kick or punch thrown in anger. In private, Chuck Norris often reflected on the ripple effect of that night. As his own students became teachers, and their students in turn passed on the lesson, he realized that what happened in the ring was never really about just two men. It was about what happens when we let go of the need to conquer others and finally face the part of ourselves that fears, doubts, and resists growth. He continued to teach until the end of his days, not chasing applause or fame, but living the very principles he'd embodied on that legendary evening. The real battle, he would say quietly, is not outside, but within. His words resonated in countless hearts, not because of who he was, but because of what he showed was possible for anyone. Joe Louis, for his part, became a kind of folk hero, a man who turned public defeat into a lifelong journey of personal mastery. He was invited to speak everywhere, from universities to youth centers to military academies. He never minimized the sting of loss, nor did he shy away from his former arrogance. Instead, he used his story as proof that change is possible, and that no matter how public your mistakes, it's never too late to choose humility and become a true student once again. Over time, the rivalry between Chuck and Joe was remembered less as a contest of force and more as a model of reconciliation and growth. They became friends, quietly supporting each other's causes and showing up at events with a shared smile that said, "We know what we lived through, and it matters more than words can say." Media outlets and sports historians tried year after year to capture the secret of their lasting legacy. The answer always came back to the same thing. Neither man ever stopped learning. Neither let victory or defeat define his worth. Each had discovered the rarest power of all, the ability to use adversity as fuel for transformation and to inspire others to do the same. Even beyond the world of martial arts, the tale of that summer night found its way into every place where people strive, fail, learn, and try again. In boardrooms, hospitals, classrooms, and community centers, it was retold as a parable about character, courage, and the enduring value of respect. And so, in the final reckoning, The true winner of that legendary fight was not the man whose hand was raised by the referee, but the spirit of growth that both fighters came to represent. Their story became a torch, passed from one seeker to the next, illuminating the path for all who follow. Whenever someone stands at the crossroads of pride and humility, of certainty and learning, the echoes of that night in Las Vegas still linger. Substance outlasts style. Mastery speaks louder than bravado. And true power is found not in domination, but in the willingness to grow again and again for a lifetime. So if you find yourself facing your own fight, a challenge, a moment of doubt, a test of character, remember what happened in the grand arena. Remember that the greatest transformation always happens on the inside, and that every opponent, every setback, every hard lesson is really just a mirror showing you the next step toward becoming who you're meant to be. And if you ever forget, just picture it. Two men, under the bright lights, bowing not in defeat or victory, but in mutual respect. A silent agreement that the journey never truly ends.